Okay, so dear colleagues, it is my pleasure to present to you our Professor Anna Ivanova, who will be presenting the next topic in our program.
Hello everyone, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, so as you heard, my name is Anna Ivanova. I'm very happy to be here today with this international group of yours because we're having a lecture on intercultural communication, so we will have the chance not only to discuss the theoretical aspects of this topic, but also have some practical experiences and engagement with the concepts of intercultural dialogue. So today I will share with you some practical implications of the challenges of intercultural communications and ways to tackle these challenges that I hope will be useful in your professional practice in the academia, whether you work with students from other nationalities or colleagues and partners, if you're engaged in some sorts of mutual projects. What we're going to do is first, we are going to draw some general theoretical principles that will give us a conceptual framing of understanding the specificities of communication and intercultural communication in specific. Then we're going to talk about differences in people's communicative styles that are related to people's cultural background. And finally, we will try to make sense of these differences in terms of different examples by having different activities here, and hopefully at the end we will have a discussion in which you could share your own experiences from your practices on how you tackled these differences. Since everybody comes from a different context and is engaged in a different kind of activities, some of you are perhaps managers or administrative managers, others are lecturers, we will begin with some general basics of this problematic, and then we will delve into specificities. So, we will get to see what is communication and what is the effective way to communicate. Now, communication, as we are all aware, is fundamental to human existence because it sustains cooperation, mutual problem solving, and other practices in a community. We need to communicate in order to exist socially. Hence, as social creatures, we are biologically predisposed to seek interactions, and we develop certain tools to communicate. Culture plays an important part in the development of our communicative activities. Basically, it shapes the way in which we interpret social reality, and it provides us with different channels of communication. And because communication is a trivial matter, we all know what it is. It's an intentional exchange of information among people, between at least two individuals. But despite this triviality, in science, in fact, and in the academia, there's little agreement about the actual mechanics of communication. That is, how is it performed? There are various competing models coming from theoretical linguistics, semiotics, pragmatics, philosophy of language, and psychology. Perhaps some of you have encountered such models and have competence in this domain. And the main challenge for these models is to try to explain how a mental image or an idea of a speaker is transformed into some physical form, like a physical event, a verbal utterance, or a physical sign, like an image or a letter. And when that physical form is detected by another person, it is converted back into an idea or into some sort of meaning. So this process is hard to understand. How do we do that exactly? So one example of how this is done is typically called the code model. This is a label assigned by two notable pragmatists, Wilson and Sperber, and they provide an example with Shannon's and Weaver's mathematical theory of communication. So this is one example of what is happening in communication, On the left side we would have the speaker, and on the right side we would have the listener, or other kinds of individuals interacting. So the basic idea behind this rather complicated scheme is that both speaker and listener possess some common code that they use in order to transform a certain idea or message into a physical signal. Then that signal is detected through some device called the receiver. The listener is hearing the physical sign of an utterance and transforms it back into an idea. And in order for us to communicate effectively within this code model, all we need is to have a common code. We need to have the same coding system to interpret a signal into a meaning. So the code model is rather old, as you can see. It's assigned to Aristotle, to John Locke, to Saussure, and it dominated the intellectual landscape of studies and communication in the first half of the 20th century, perhaps. Then a competitor arose, the inference model, and in the inference model, the physical signs of verbal behavior, of communicative behavior, what we actually do, what is observable in a communicative situation, are viewed not as expressions of or applications of a code, but rather as certain kind of evidence about our communicative intentions. So the listener does not automatically apply a certain code. Rather, the listener is trying to decipher the information through using various competing codes. He's testing in a rational way what is the most probable intention of this person. So there are always more than one interpretations of the behavior. But the bottom line is that there is a coding system. It could be a system of signs, of written symbols, of observed patterns of behavior. So we humans employ a number of ways to communicate. Part of the reasons why having a model of communication is so difficult is the variety of the ways in which we communicate. Like communicating through some piece of art, for example, a dance, is very different from communication through verbal language or through mathematical science. So trying to capture all these various aspects of communication is rather tricky. Human creativity, of course, is endless, and as many cultures as we have, there's many different ways of communicating. So what is the role of culture in communication? Well, culture is our primary source of various coding systems. In order to communicate successfully, we need a common medium of interaction. We need to share certain social norms, principles, and rules, because communication is a cooperative endeavor. So culture is the domain in which this cooperation is sustained by such background principles and rules. This is the condition for our successful communication. So since our upbringing, we are taught into developing different codes for communicating. That's one of the reasons why, according to some researchers, like the American anthropologist Edward Hall, culture is itself communication, both in terms of essence, in terms of the artifact, developed models and forms, values, worldviews, attitudes people that have, and in terms of its function, because it sustains cooperation, it sustains agreement, provides people with their own identity, structures human life in certain ways. But culture is more than that. Culture is basically a system of taught and learned models of behavior, behavioral habits that provide an effortless and fluent existence in a society. And how does it do that? It does that by making the behavior of members of a certain culture really easily tractable and predictable. We can easily predict in certain social situations how others will react within our own culture. For this reason, Geert Hofstede calls culture a collective programming of the mind that distinguishes one group of people from another. We have this certain mental software that we use in communication to interpret what people are telling us, and we use the same software to convey our own meaning or our own messages. We want to be understood in a certain way, and we want to prompt a certain kind of response. So ordinarily, what makes us comfortable in communication is the easy way to predict other people's behavior. For instance, let's say if I go to the pharmacy and I ask for a pill, I would expect the person behind the counter to answer me in the usual manner, to provide me with the pill, say, here's your pill, I will thank them, I will pay. And this is a trivial exchange of information that is guided by the use of common language, we will talk in the same language, and by the social conventions that exist for this specific type of social situations. I do not expect the person to suddenly start to sing, or surprise me with something, or give me water instead of the pill. So I'm comfortable in this situation that things can happen in a quite fluent and easy manner. So we can say that one important aspect of the function of culture is to sustain the predictability of human behavior. So what happens when people's coding systems differ in one way or another? This is the case of intercultural communication, as a species of communication between people with two different cultural identities. These are situations where people have different sets of codes for interpreting behavior. Our codes would only partially overlap. Of course, if we are conversing with a representative of another culture, at least we have a common language. Maybe we would talk into a second language that is not our native for the both of us, and so we have some overlapping. Perhaps we share certain social conventions and rules, protocols that are typical of our communicative situation. Let's say we are colleagues, there are protocols for colleagues, or we are politicians in a diplomacy meeting, there are other protocols there. But these overlapping coding systems are only partial, and for the most part there are differences, because every culture is unique and human creativity is endless. As I said, we have so many ways to interpret a certain kind of verbal or non-verbal behavior. People would tend in communication to use more than one code. For instance, I might be talking, but also I will be gesturing. So I will convey meaning through both verbal and non-verbal signs. So the listener would need to use more than one code on one and the same communicative occasion. So this presents us with a difficulty. If there is, for instance, a mismatch between the verbal meaning of an utterance, of what we are saying, and the non-verbal meaning that we are conveying through the language of signs or face expression or gestures, which meaning shall we give preference to? Which one is the speaker meaning? What is said is not the same as what is meant. In pragmatics, we distinguish between linguistic meaning on the one hand and speaker meaning, the intended meaning of an utterance, what we want to convey. And the intended meaning usually makes use not only of the verbal, the literal, the linguistic meaning of a language, but also makes use of the communicative situation, the level of shared knowledge, some social principles and cues that allow us to imply something, to make a hint or suggestion. So this makes intercultural communication difficult, because people will tend to use different tools to convey meaning. And of course, this can bring sometimes difficulties, and it can be frustrating for a person. Why frustrating? Because in these situations, sometimes we find out that the general principle of just having good intentions and adopting what one considers from their own cultural perspective to be a friendly approach is not interpreted as friendly, or it's hard to bring us to our purposes. The optimistic view that as long as we are sincere, as long as we are engaged and committed, we have good intentions and try to be objective and to explain well our communicative intentions, we might encounter a number of difficulties because the implication of various codes that come from culture is semi-conscious. Often we are unaware of what we are doing and we are unable to distinguish between what was literally said and our interpretation of the communication. Because interpretation is automatic, it is based on certain communicative habits that we have developed. It happens really quickly and we just befall into a certain meaning that could be the wrong one, and we could be in a situation of misunderstanding what the person is telling us. So we can try to classify the different experiences that we might have in an intercultural communication where not everything is going smooth. So the first one is a sense of ambiguity, the inability to understand the exact intentions of the speaker. They are telling us something, but we fail to apply the communicative roles that tell us what the exact speaker meaning is. For instance, we fail to recognize the relevance of what they are saying, or their manner of expression sounds obscure or unfamiliar to us in one way or another. We are not sure about their attitude towards a certain issue, whether they are just stating facts or whether they're expressing opinion or some kind of attitude. So this leads to a sense of uncertainty because one of the basic features of communication, the predictability, is distorted. We are in a position where we are unable to predict the other person's behavior. Say, we are in a typical social situation. In our cultural perspective, we expect one thing to happen, however, something else is happening. Maybe a routine situation, maybe we'll ask for a pill in the pharmacy, but things go in a slightly different manner than in our own national culture. So because we are unable to have such predictions, this raises the level of anxiety. According to many studies, like Veliko study, there's a whole theory about how people try to mitigate anxiety in communication, not only in intercultural, but also in intracultural situations as well. So we experience anxiety, different sorts of anxiety. Fear of being misunderstood or of offending others. Fear of coming out as awkward or strange or maybe clumsy in communication, embarrass oneself, and ultimately fear of being rejected. So researchers have tried to overcome these difficulties by laying out some components of intercultural competence that one needs to possess in order to communicate fluently and effectively in intercultural context. For instance, we can look at Lorraine Barner's roots of intercultural misunderstanding that she calls stumbling blocks. These are things we do in intercultural communication that provide conditions for misunderstanding. One is the assumption of similarities. Another is language differences that we already mentioned. The third one is non-verbal misinterpretations. Well, this one is very important because despite the fact that psychologists have shown that in terms of verbal expressions, we share some universal features, like the faces of people all across the globe are the same when they are afraid, when they're happy, when they are angry, etc. The facial muscles basically are the same. So since we are children, we learn to recognize these patterns of facial expressions. However, culture tells us in a certain situation what to suppress, what is admissible or appropriate to show in a conversation, and what has to be hidden, when is one to remain silent. Also, there are conventional ways to have a face expression for certain situations. And in terms of gestures, there are wild variations among cultures, as I'm sure you have had the experience yourself. So in this sense, this is a very big factor contributing to misunderstandings, because we don't consciously detect non-verbal manners of speech. We just are left with a general sense or an impression of what is happening. And that impression could be very, very misleading. and we cannot overcome it because we cannot make it conscious, we cannot make it a target of our rational investigation. Another big stumbling block is the preconceptions and stereotypes we tend to use, because in a situation of intercultural communication, we are in a sort of a knowledge deficit. We don't know the background of coding systems of this person that we are conversing with. We don't know their context within which they interpret situations and facts. And in situations where there is knowledge deficit, we are pressed to make a quick judgment, and because of this pressure, we tend to use some very simply, imperfect tools for evaluation of information. We present the tendency to use stereotypes, oversimplifications, minimizations, and other tools to just explain the behavior. And of course, this leads to misunderstanding. And the last two features are the tendency to evaluate and high anxiety that we already mentioned. So how does one overcome these challenges? Typical approaches would be to develop 3 sets of competencies, as we said: knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And researchers would offer us an amount of ways to handle these problems. However, these approaches mostly are piece by piece. We are taught by certain kinds of exercises to be objective, to be interculturally sensitive, to be aware of others, etc. So this is something that presents us with a difficulty, the traditional approaches, in terms of what we do in a communicative situation. Well, communication is not a case where one can rationally consider their hypotheses, think deeply, compare different suggestions. Communication is a quick and intuitive affair. We need, right on the spot, to have a leading interpretation of what the speaker is saying. So we need to be able to recognize certain patterns of communicative behavior as a system, not piece of piece, but rather as a general image. So an alternative new approaches from the second half of the 20th century would suggest that we would learn whole patterns or discourses instead of this piece-by-piece approach, such as the systematic approach, for example, in philosophy, the discourse approach by Skolland and Skolland, the epistemic approach, and others. So what we're going to do is, within these approaches, we will explore some differences in people's communicative styles and how authors classified cultures with respect to these differences. Okay, so what is a communicative style? Communicative style is the manner in which a person shapes their expressions in communication. It comprises of many things. We can try to classify 2 components, general components. The first one are people's linguistic preferences. For instance, the degree to which direct speech is used instead of just hinting or suggesting, how much context is used in communication, do we use more metaphors, do we use more soft language or hard language, how important is nonverbal behavior in our communicative practices. The second aspect of communicative style is related to social preferences and norms. Is there an appropriate way to handle a certain kind of communicative situation? Should one be formal or informal? When is the right time to start speaking on a first-name basis? When is the right time to interrupt and ask a question? How does a conversation end? Are there any topics that are considered unacceptable or a taboo? So this is also part of our communicative styles. So now we will try to see whether there are certain general tendencies that help us discriminate between one communicative style and another that are related to culture. Now, researchers in anthropology, social sciences, and many other fields have offered us various types of classifications. We should bear in mind, though, that these are, since there are generalizations, there's also the risk of stereotyping. These have some limited domain of applicability. We don't say they're valid for all members of a culture. We might also expect some of these to have changed over time. We should bear in mind that these are mostly suggestive. But still they provide us with various points of interesting ways in which cultures might differ or individuals might differ, because difference in communicative style could be due to some individual specificities of the person. They could not be due to some specific cultural background. So let's take a look at some distinctions and try to see their relevance for our academic practices. So in terms of linguistic preferences, the American anthropology Edward Hall distinguishes between the so-called low context cultures and high context cultures. Has anybody heard of this distinction? Low and high context cultures? No? Okay, let's say a few words because it's a part of his bigger distinction among cultures. So in low context cultures, people tend to express what they want to say, mostly through verbal messages. The speaker meaning is carried out by explicit statements. Little is left to the context of the situation, little is left to some sort of common knowledge. People don't imply generally, they don't make hints, they don't suggest that the other person knows something. Little is taken for granted. There is a lot of explanation going on. Everyone is very explicit about their communicative intention. In terms of society, clear instructions are provided about everything. You can read, you need to be well informed, there are procedures for informing everyone, so there are formal ways to distribute information. For instance, in a university, we would have there what? We would have very well written rules and practices established, instructions for everything, ways and protocols for information to flow within the organization. Formal ways instead of informal ways. There's preference to formal ways of information distribution. Now, in high context cultures, the situation is rather different. High context cultures are cultures in which preference is given to personal contact, to communication with others, and establishing bonds with others is cherished and valued. In high context cultures, people typically would have an extended network of family, friends, and colleagues that they will constantly keep in touch with. The information flow is very quick and its roots are very informal. Everybody gets updated about everything all the time. As a result, people share a lot of common context. They don't need to explain each other everything, and they start to communicate in a more economic manner that might seem to an outsider a bit discreet or puzzling. Also, because so much context is shared, context becomes more important. Talk becomes suggestive. People from such cultures are typically more delicate or considerate of others' feelings. They might try to indicate what they want to say instead of going straight forward. Being direct might be considered even rude or inconsiderate at times in such cultures. So the discourse is suggestive. More social rules exist about communication because communication is infused into the social reality. There are many rituals here. And people would tend to rely on informal contact. Sometimes rules and distinctions, instructions are not clearly provided because people expect to learn what is relevant to their activities from a person, not say from a web page or from some written text. So this reflects the way in which organizations, including the academia, is established. So some examples, can you think of low context cultures in your experience and high context cultures? Anybody? Okay, would you like to share what do you think is your culture? Is it more on the scale? Of course, this is a comparative measure, and we said every generalization is a simplification of some sort, it's not universally valid. However, it is useful to consider that there is such a dimension in communication that is relevant to cultural differences. So, to a certain degree, if you have to compare your culture to other cultures, perhaps to Bulgarian culture, if you are familiar enough already. So what would you say? Would you say the culture is more of high context, where people keep constantly in touch and know everything and are more informal and keep close relationships to really have the background of every piece of information, or is it more a culture where everything is stated explicitly and the most meaning is carried out by explicit statements? Okay, please go ahead. Yes, of course. You can turn on your microphone if you would like. Or just
I don't have a microphone, but I'm loud enough, so we can, I hope that all colleagues can hear me very well. So when it comes to my country, situation is pretty interesting in terms of, so to say, intercultural differences that we are living. And when it comes to this, today in globalization, we are witnessing something what is known as acceptance of other cultures. And hence, when we are talking about this, I'm not sure whether anymore we are the culture which basically analyzes everything, where we try really to understand our interlocutor in terms of providing all the details, but sometimes under the influence of the new technologies and new media, basically we are like receiving information instantly. So may I ask you something in regards to this? Do you think that somehow this approach can be upgraded to a new level, where we have both combinations present in cultures internationally?
yes, certainly. Thank you. Could you please mention, in terms of national culture, what is your national culture?
Yeah, definitely high context culture. My national culture is more contextualized, and everything what we say depends on the context where the given sentence, where the given basically statement is said, in which context. There is no text without context. We know that from the modern linguistics, so definitely we can apply that on a Bosnian, contemporary Bosnian and Slovenian culture.
Thank you. I see. Thank you. Yes, I would also suggest that Bulgaria is also in the scale of high context cultures. So yes, certainly this distinction is just a hint or just a suggestion of what we might observe. However, since cultures evolve, there are many specificities regarding national cultures. First, we could speak of culture as well, an entity that is related to a nation, but we could also speak of generation culture, we can speak of professional culture. There are many subcultures. We can distinguish between urban culture and small town culture, for example. And in urban cultures tend to be more low context, while small town cultures tend to be more high context for obvious reasons. So, of course, we can observe many divergences within a single nation regarding this distinction. Also, at work, we might tend to be more low context, and with family, we tend to be high context. So these are also things to consider. But according to Edward Hall, there are general patterns that shape society as an organizational structure that are related to the employment of culture. For instance, according to him, United States and Northern European nations, in Switzerland, for example, are low context cultures, or at least more low context than Mediterranean cultures, which are considered by him to be high context cultures. For him, Chinese culture is also high context. So we can ask how to handle these differences. For instance, in the academia, some of you teach students, some of you interact with students, international students in the offices. How does a student who comes from a very high context culture would tend to act in comparison to a student who comes from a low context culture? In my experience with international students, ones that are from a very high context culture would tend to, in their behavior, they would tend to seek information through personal contact. For instance, they might pay less attention to emails or written instructions about the structure of the course, about deadlines or the written assignment and everything else. and they would ask personally somebody in the office to give them an explanation on their curriculum, because their intuition is that there is a lot of context to be filled in. There are many things to know, and the best way to get informed is to ask somebody, because people possess all the information. Also, they would present themselves, they would make sure, because personal contact is important to them, even in the first class, to introduce themselves to the lecturer, to have a little small talk, to just get familiar with the situation, with the people they're going to work with or have some activities with. And students who come from a context culture that is more low context than Bulgarian culture will typically look for clear instructions. They will look for the protocol. Everything is planned in advance. They will maintain communication mostly through emails, and they will not insist on having personal contact with somebody in the Erasmus office or just to know a person. They will just need for the formal way in which information flows. In the class, it's the same. Students from low context culture would look at the instructions, they would ask questions if they don't understand something, they would make it clear what their misunderstanding is or what they need to know. And students from high context culture would tend to be more delicate, perhaps they would be suggestive, and we have to pay more attention or be more sensitive to their inquiries, because sometimes they might feel that asking a straightforward question might come out as offensive or rude. Maybe they would worry to not offend the lecturer if they misunderstood something or need more clarification. So we would have to ask more questions and be more attentive to their answers. So I don't know if you have encountered these differences, but it's really useful in terms of practical matters. And in terms of communication with partners, this distinction is also very useful, because if we are in a big international project and most of the members in this project are from a high context culture, we are to expect first a lot of discussions so that everybody can be filled in the background information. People will be asking questions, there will be some noise. A lot of time will be taken to get everybody really informed, and not by emails, not by instructions, but in a live conversation and discussion. And after a certain point is reached, decisions really come quickly when everybody has the context, when everybody is fully aware of the situation. And in a low context culture, it's the other way around. You would have most of the information beforehand in terms of emails, in terms of instruction, what will happen. Meetings tend to be shorter and straight on the point, not so much small talk involved, etc. So this distinction relates to another distinction in people's communicative style. Directed, indirect manner of speech. I've provided for you some examples. This is a pretty straightforward distinction, very intuitive. Typically, representatives of low context cultures tend to be more direct, and high context cultures tend to be more indirect, because they would rely more on context. In any kind of social situation, okay, let's see a typical work situation. Somebody wants information, and they would, in a direct manner, say, I need you to send me an email with this information. And in a more indirect manner, a person might say, like, it might be useful if I as well have this information. Would it be convenient for you to send me an email? Or some kind of longer and less straightforward expression. You have to tell me what you want me to do, instead of, I would need some instructions provided by anybody who's responsible for delivering them to me. I disagree with you on this point. Instead of, for instance, perhaps there are some objections to what you're saying, or maybe not everyone might agree with you. And examples of indirect manner. In my previous school, teachers did not give us homework for the holidays. What does it substitute? it substitutes like, teacher, please don't give us homework for the holidays. Straightforward expression. My dad always said I should not interrupt people. My substitute, on some occasions, my substitutes, I'm sorry I interrupted you. Or perhaps my substitute, please do not interrupt me because I don't feel comfortable. And finally, as we mentioned, perhaps not everyone would agree with you, standing for I disagree with you. So these are adopted ways to express something in an indirect manner. So indirect manner, as we said, is typical for high context cultures because people there are considerate of people's feelings. Being direct and straightforward is in low context cultures considered to be an appreciation of the person. Why? Well, Dutch people, for example, are known to be very direct. It's considered to be an appreciation because the person has shown that they value sincerity and honesty, because we tend to be less, let's say, less open to a person we don't respect as much. So being direct is a sign of respect for people who employ the direct speech manner. However, for people from high context cultures, this might come out as rude or inappropriate in certain situations. They would appreciate the honesty, however they would say, yes, your opinion has been conveyed and I appreciate your opinion, really wanted to know what it is as it is. However, your lack of concern with whether I might be offended could be interpreted as a sign of disrespect. So the opposite effect is of what is happening. Both parties believe they are good, they have good intentions, and they are honoring the face of the other person, but we reach the opposite results. So being aware of just the existence of these differences might help us. Another linguistic preference, really quickly, is the structure of discourse. When is the positioning of the main point? When does it happen? It's also relevant to our university practices. Well, according to Scholin and Scholin, in one of their studies on the differences between the Japanese and the Americans, according to them, the Westerner would typically shape their discourse in such a manner that the main point is positioned at the beginning of the presentation. We start with our main thesis, perhaps we're making a presentation or a lecture. We start with the main thesis, and afterwards we fill in the arguments in favor of our position. So, because the Westerner would like for the audience to be able to trace down the rational reasoning behind their position. And of course, because they tend to be more direct and straightforward, etc. In the Eastern discourse, however, according to these two authors, the main point or idea or thesis comes last, because it's considered impolite and not serious enough to state an opinion before one has provided good reasons and justification for their opinion. So they start with their arguments first, or with some small talk, while circling around an idea, and they present it last, when the communicative conditions are set right. So this is a source of big misunderstandings. In their example, an American and a Japanese professor are talking. They happen to be alone in a room, so the American professor initiates what is considered to be small talk in the United States. So he talks about the weather, different kinds of things. They have some nice talk, and by the end of the conversation, the American professor is saying, "It was so nice talking to you, we should get together and have dinner sometime," which is like a polite end of this conversation. However, the Japanese professor, who is accustomed to looking for the main point in the end of the conversation, interprets this whole communicative situation in an entirely different manner. For him, the conversation was initiated so that the person can present an invitation for dinner. So the Japanese professor begins to wait for the call when they're going to tell him when and where the dinner will take place. And he comes to conclude that his American partner is rather superficial or not serious, because he makes some engagements and sets out some common plans and then fails to continue to deliver. So this creates, as Colin and Scollin say, creates the unfair and prejudicial stereotypes of the inscrutable Asian or of the Frankenbrut Westerner. So social patterns and norms, there are many various in literature. We will only take a look at some really quickly, most popular ones. Perhaps you have heard about this distinction between peach and coconut cultures. Has anybody? Peach and coconut culture. Okay, it's a distinction developed by Danish researchers. Again, in the middle of the 20th century, there are many amendments to this theory, but it is a, well, let's say a useful distinction for first-hand contacts when we have to initiate the first contact with the person we don't know in the cultural context. So, what is typical of peach cultures? A peach culture is a culture where people would tend to be more soft or friendly with people they encounter for the first time, with strangers and distant acquaintances. They will be smiling more to strangers. They will freely initiate contact first. They will freely provide personal information about themselves regardless of the situation. They would ask personal questions. They would be very informal and quite friendly. They might even occasionally touch people they don't know well, tap on the shoulder, have distant acquaintances, etc. And everybody is really smiling a lot in the peach culture. However, after the first friendly encounters, one gets to see that this is just a communicative style. This is what is in accordance with the social convention. People don't actually uncover everything they are. This is not to be interpreted as a sort of straightforward, deep commitment and bond. And a person might get to the shell of the pit, where the peach protects its real self. In contrast to this peach kind of cultures, the coconut cultures tend to be more slow in their progress with strangers. They are more reserved and closed at first. They would use or stick to conventions that are appropriate for communicative situations. If you are in professional background, you will stay professional till the end. If you are on a party, you will say things that are appropriate for a party. So these are people who would really smile at strangers. The lady in the pharmacy will not smile back at you, or the gentleman. Also, they would seldom ask personal questions, nor would they provide personal information about themselves. But over time, as we get to know each other, a coconut will break its protection, they will begin to trust, and slowly we will move to a more softer side of the people, and we will develop friendship. So it takes longer to befriend a person from a coconut culture. However, friendships tend to last longer, are more well-defined, and we can say can overcome certain challenges. So these are, well, some distinction or suggestions of distinction that we can learn to spot and recognize as general patterns of people's behavior. Some of those might be due to cultural background. Some of those might be due to individual differences or preferences of people, depending on their family background. Some other psychological factors can be in play. It's not all related to culture. However, having the whole pattern is really informative in terms of handling the situation and choosing the right interpretation of people's communicative behavior. So, can you also try to state really quickly, and this way we can learn about national cultures. Would you say your culture is more of a peach culture or of a coconut culture? If this distinction applies, if it doesn't apply, of course, you can state why. So, yes, please go ahead.
I think my culture is more like a peach because we are very friendly and we speak to person even without knowing them, talk to them, smile at them. That's why I think we are peaches.
Okay, any coconut?
She's working with students, so
Okay, anyone coming from a coconut culture? Yes, please go ahead.
So I'm from Germany, and I think we are the best example for we are not so easy to access, as you said. We are also a low, what was it? Low context culture. Everything sums up in our culture.
Thank you. Anybody?
Does it come from the culture or some moral issues?
I don't know. I think it's, as you said, normal European cultures tend to be in such a way.
Okay, we're going around the table, so please go ahead.
I'm from Egypt. Okay. We are a Abish culture. We are say hello for everyone. But we have town culture, but it is normally it is our person in fact. It is around the traffic light. Here you don't have a traffic light. Okay, when somebody wanted to cross the road, the person is center and all cars will stop for him and but in my country, when I cross the road, I look for eyes of the drive and I want to cross. If he allow me, when I cross the road, he gives beep, and if he don't allow, beep.
You would insist.
And then so I will stand for him cross, and then I will try to cross the road again.
Thank you.
Allow me to say something.
Yes, please go ahead.
We tend to trust or like to get in contact or work with or handle with people from coconut because we suffer from our beach behavior. So yeah, I was telling you yesterday, we work very well with Germans because we like their commitment. Yeah, it's not easy to access, but once you work with these people, they are very committed people, they are very online, and everything is clear and very well explained, and sometimes we lack this in our cultures. I mean, positive sides and negative sides as well. So we really like to work with coconut cultures. Also, I've tried communicating with Japanese people as well. I have been only working in the international office for almost 1 year now. So I've been behind exchanging emails with different partners from different countries. But it was my first time a few months ago to communicate with Japanese people. And I was very surprised, I have to say, that they exchanged many emails just to ask. But we were just trying to arrange a meeting. And normally what we say, just agree on a time, and then we lead everything to the meeting. For them, they were asking, who is going to attend? What are the points to be discussed? Can you send us a scheduled agenda for the meeting? Like so many questions that are eventually, by the time we arrived to the meeting, it was very good. It was a very productive meeting. But it was for us very strange that no other partner that I have been dealing with who asked so many questions and so many details regarding our first meeting.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's also, it has a very positive side as well.
Thank you so much for sharing. Yes, this is very, very important because according to Edward Paul, the Japanese are unique in this manner that they are extremely low context in their work and very high context in their informal relationships. So there is this distinction there that makes unique their approach to business in general. Okay, so somebody else wanted to share? Please go ahead. Yes?
We would like to
Okay, please.
Yes,
In Portugal, we are totally beach. Not total, because there are different personalities, of course. Yes.
And chickens.
We have different personalities, so there are people that are more coconut, people that are more peaches, but everywhere is like that. But we are really friendly, and we receive very well others. We talk a lot. We talk with everyone. We smile a lot. We give hugs and kisses. We give lots of kisses, really.
In Portugal. In Bulgaria, no.
When we arrive to a party, we give 2 kisses to everyone. So, yes. No, shake hands. Between guys, girls with
Boys.
women and men, 2 kisses, and women 2 kisses. And it's really hard, and I'm glad that in most of these cultures, you don't give 2 kisses, because we would have to give 2 kisses to everyone. That's really good to know. Okay, and finally, please go ahead, because
Hi, Indonesia. So Indonesia, in terms of peach and coconut, we have both, because we have 360 tribes, and the main we have 5 biggest islands, and 2 of them is Java Island and Sumatra Island. So Sumatra Islands, the people tends to be coconut, but the Java Island, the people tends to be peach. Yeah, so we combine with both. Yeah. But in terms of high and low context, we are more on the high context. And I myself, for example, I also teach international students. But because I've also learned my master program in the United States, so I treat them equally. I mean, Indonesian student, international students. So if I say like this one, sometimes if they don't know me, they said that, oh, Ibu Yeti, Miss Yeti, are you mad with us? Because the way I'm speaking. So in the very beginning, in the very first session, I told my international student, this is the way I talk. So if I talk like this, it doesn't mean that I'm angry with you. So yeah, you need to be able to, you give the context in the international with international students. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes. One of the biggest challenges is determining the context, especially in intercultural communication. I myself have also experienced this. It's a challenge to teach intercultural competence to an intercultural crowd. It's one thing is a monocultural crowd, and quite another if it's an intercultural group. Because you don't know what you begin with. How much does anybody know? How much they study? Which program do they come from? What are their competences? So you have to set some communicative rules beforehand, or just explain your own behavior. Be very conscious about what you're doing in the situation, because it's there are a number of sensitive topics. So yes, please share.
We come from Albania, however, that depends on your experience, though. I mean, I've been working in the National Relation Office for more than 15 years, and I'm a full-time lecturer anyway, so. And I work with coconut culture, with gift culture, with everybody, but it depends on basis on our interrelationship connections. For example, I've worked with University in Portugal for a long time, with University of Porto and University of Lisbon, and we have a really great collaboration. I work with University of Germany, University of Dresden, Parabon, and all those, and we have working with them for more than 12 years, so we know how to deal. It depends on your personal relations that you have with people. I mean, of course, you have to put boundaries and all that, those kind of things, but however, if you know each other personally, it gives you a much more, easier way to approach people than when you go, just, okay, I want a university in Germany, let's go approach them, We work with University of with Nürnberg right now. We have a project with them, so it depends on a personal basis as well. But coming from the Balkans, we're more, noisy people than usually people from Germany. I don't think the Portuguese people are, quiet, so they're pretty happy, and because I've been working with them for a while. I don't know about the Egypt and the rest of them because I've never worked with them. them, but as far as the European, you know, especially the Balkans, you know, we've been working with Greek people for a long time as well, so we have pretty much the same culture when it comes to, you know, but this is what I'm saying, it depends on the personal basis as well, though. It doesn't depend only on the country culture, you know, it depends on the personal basis. You have to build, you know, from, if you have 1 year, it depends. If you have a lot of years working in the office, it depends. So it's not like you can.
Yes, usually challenges appear on this first level, first ground level, the first encounters, when we don't know the person very well.
But once you have the connections, then it's much more easier, you know, to go, you know, go and apply for new projects and do, you know, and teach. And when you have so many students coming, then you get used to them. You know what, for example, the German students need. You know what the Portuguese students need. You know what the Bulgarian students need. You know what the Greek students need. So it makes life easier on that part.
So are you able to recognize the discourse right away in communicative pattern? You say, it's a person from mostly like this type of culture or another type of culture.
You have some kind of expectation, you know, so you know what to deal with.
Yes, so that's the best way to develop intercultural competence through experience. But unfortunately, at times we are not able to study everything and learn everything about a particular culture. We have to act on the spot in a certain way. Okay, so does anybody want to share something else? Okay then, so thank you all for your contribution. I hope this was useful in terms of practical relevance to your professional work. Perhaps some of these ideas I myself got really enriched could be used in the context. Okay, thank you. That will be all.
Thank you very much.